Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to the Valley of the Judged. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a, not necessarily a newcomer to the temple, but a newcomer to the valley. Coming to us from the Wanderer's Library, good brother Sigmund.
And when offered the chance to study something new, I gladly took him up on his offer.
So, we are here with a brand new season, as I mentioned previously. Yesterday, we started off a new season with Brother Monarch and I covering the first bit of Shroud of the Ancients, and with Sig and I, we're gonna be covering Tokyo Nova. Now, I will get a few caveats out of the way. The version of Tokyo Nova we're covering is not the original, but a more recent edition called the Acceleration. I say recent, but I think the Acceleration came out in the late 2010s. Tokyo Nova's been around a while, is what I'm saying. Like the first version of it came out all the way in 1993, which isn't surprising to me because the early 90s seemed to be where tabletop in Japan really started to expand. But one of the publishers is Enterbrain, which is a company I am very familiar with. And like I said, the version that we're covering is the Acceleration, which was a successor to the Detonation, I believe. Now, this is the case where a lot of the info is secondhand. Mostly because, well, there is a article of this on Wikipedia. It's just the basics of things. But there were a couple reasons I wanted to cover this one in particular. One, we are delving into Japanese cyberpunk, but also this game uses a card-based system. And card-based systems are very rare. There's only a handful of them that I have in my library, and I still maintain that card-based systems have a lot of untapped potential that hasn't been realized simply because fewer people utilize them. Which is silly to me because everybody's got a playing card deck or has got access to one. I mean, you can get them in gas stations, for fuck's sake.
I know I've got my share of them.
Mm-hmm. And I know that there's special ones that are used by card sharks. But obviously in covering another Japanese TTRPG, there are a few things that we have to reestablish that I've talked about before. I talked about this when I covered Double Moon a few months back. Not a few months back, that was a month ago. And when doing the study hall, when we did the Sword World campaign and a bunch of other matters. The world of TTRPGs in Japan has a different philosophy and is a different beast. I'd say one of the big changes you're going to see is a lot of games are laser focused on a particular vibe, a particular setting, or something like that. There isn't as many one size fits all kind of games, and universalist style games are almost unheard of when it comes to the in-house stuff. There's been flirtations with GURPS over the years, but not since the 80s. And as I mentioned a month ago, Tunnels and Trolls kind of stole D&D's thunder in Japan. And I will argue until I'm blue in the face that any game that, or any anime, or any video game that people say is, that came out of Japan that people say is inspired by D&D is more likely inspired by wizardry. Because wizardry was huge in Japan and is still getting Japanese based expansions to that franchise as recently as 3 days ago.
I heard one of them, I think it was the mobile game, got a port on Steam recently.
Yeah. I don't know how good or bad that port is, and there's been a few others that have cropped up. But wizardry got a much bigger following in Japan than it did in the States. It still has a healthy following in the States, obviously, but it's got a bigger following in Japan. And that following led to the chain of events that would lead to the wizardry TTRPG in the late 80s, or the chain of events that would lead to Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest, one of the initial ideas behind it was to do something like wizardry, but simplified for the Famicom.
And oh, what a hit it became!
Mm-hmm. Of course, the other thing was that Shueisha wanted their own computer RPG to promote in their magazine, which was how Toriyama got involved with it, because Shueisha is also the overseer of Jump.
And they also wrote him in to send in some monster designs, and he just sent a bunch of little goofy doodles, and they became the staple of the series as a whole.
Yeah, the bigger end of the equation was Yuji Horii, who had a literary background, and that's part of the reason he was tapped for the project. But this is the reason why you see that first-person perspective in combat for like early Dragon Quest or Phantasy Star, or even the early Megami Tensei games, and some of the more recent ones, if I'm being honest. That particular dungeon crawling style, going square by square in a first-person perspective in a dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing traces its origins to wizardry. I know Ultima did it as well, but Ultima's approach is more akin to the game books in the UK more than anything else. And Ultima was one of the other things that played a bit of inspiration when it came to the original Final Fantasy, but that's another story. But the point is that a lot of TTRPGs in Japan are laser focused on doing one particular thing, whether that be a setting, whether that be a particular vibe, and are not really interested in the whole, oh, you can use this to run anything kind of thinking. Even though, like, for example, even though Goblin Slayer uses the same 2d6 system that Sword World does, the two games aren't compatible.
Mm-hmm.
That system was also used previously for an adaptation of Scrapped Princess, which those two are so, there's so many changes between systems that you couldn't even try to do cross compatibility with them without getting some extra work done. And you know how there's a certain mode of thinking among some people in the hobby that you shouldn't be drawing upon video games? Japan never got that memo.
Oh, they would hate some of my games then.
Well, they already. I know there's some people in that hate me, and one of them wants to take a swing at me because that's exactly what I've championed. Uh, but but what the other thing that I found amusing with this is the covering of Cyberpunk with this, and the way Cyberpunk has been utilized in anime. It will be interesting to me for one particular reason. I have been told many times until someone's blue in the face that Cyberpunk has to utilize the late stage corporatist dystopia kind of archetype. Not
Absolutely not the case.
no, and Ghost in the Shell is considered a cyberpunk series, although I would argue that it is more of a transhumanist series. But you look at a lot of the cyberpunk anime from like the 90s, during that OVA boom in anime, and that same kind of dystopia isn't really present. I've argued that the reason you saw that so much in Cyberpunk stateside was because of the corporate raider problem that was all over the financial world in the 80s. If you've seen the film Wall Street, you kind of have an idea about what I mean by corporate raider. But point is, I think the way a lot of people view Cyberpunk is stuck in 1980s futurism.
Or more recently, Cyberpunk Edge Runners. Good series, by the way.
Good series, and it. When I look at back in hindsight, it is kind of funny that people were debating whether Edge Runners or Arcane was the better video game to animation adaptation. And I still give it to Edge Runners for one particular reason. Now, don't get me wrong, I liked at the very least season 1 of Arcane. Season 2 not so much. But it comes down to how both games in question utilized the success of their particular animation. With Cyberpunk Edge Runners, we got a whole new box set focused on that cast and the like for Cyberpunk Red.
Yep.
With Arcane, the only thing that League of Legends got was a few new skins when it comes to the relevant characters there. And of course, all the problems with trying to play League to begin with. But,
oh, no kidding.
and of course, I believe that there was also some free LC of David's jacket for 2077.
And I think they had some references in the game as well as to what happened to some of the key characters after that whole event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which we've covered that. But I remember a while back I had posited the idea of doing a non-dystopian cyberpunk, and I got hell for that. That being the non-dystopian cyberpunk episode of Geek Watch from a few years ago, with people accusing me of doing a utopia, or that if you don't have that late stage corporatism, it's not cyberpunk, or that it would be just a that it would have no conflict, which is in the category of you're accusing me of me saying things I never did. And
I hate when people do that.
Because I said not a corporate dystopia. I did that. The lack of that doesn't mean a lack of conflict. And as far as the utopia argument, well, a utopia is the worst kind of dystopia.
Oh yes.
I mean, a lot of people talk up about how utopian, say, the Federation looks like in Star Trek, but holes have been poked in that utopia going all the way back to like TNG. Now, with Tokyo Nova, it's melding a bunch of genres, which is unsurprising given that you see that a lot in Japanese works. Oh. I've talked about this previously, but franchises like Final Fantasy, Suikoden, the Tales of series, ones that people associate with high fantasy, really aren't. At least not in the same way as people would assume with that terminology. What I call them is Gestalt fantasy, because you look at even the original FF and you have things like airships, time travel, the um, mind flayers at one point, even though it's called sorcerers to be legally distinct.
Or Pisco demons.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's this mix and match of elements, and you certainly have elements of more contemporary tech in several of the Tales of games. You have the blatant mixing of genres with stuff like Phantasy Star. The original Phantasy Star a little bit less so, but you definitely saw that with 2 onward. So, Tokyo Nova, it has elements of cyberpunk, it has elements of detective noir, and even elements of fantasy in its setup, as well as a bit of post-apocalypse. But the first thing that we have, like you see in a lot of games, is a selection of color pages that are kind of teasing at things. One of the first things is the Neuro deck, which is kind of an in-universe tarot deck.
I love some of the designs on these.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so instead of the standard arcana, you have the kabuki, which I guess would be the equivalent of the fool. The Basara, which is
Magician.
It's going to be the magician. It does say that on the side. The Tatra, the priestess. The mistress, the empress. The Kabuto, the emperor. The charisma, the hierophant. The mannequin is the lovers. Kaze is the chariot. Fate is. It says adjustment, but I believe number 8 in the Arcana is strength.
Yeah, I was about to say justice doesn't come later, until later, if I remember right.
Yep. Kuromaku is the hermit. Exec is they say fortune, but it's the wheel of fortune. Katana is written as lust, but I think the 11th arcana is supposed to be the devil.
The Kugutsu is judgment. Or no, the hangman, not the judgment. That's completely on me. Kage, death.
Yep. Chakra as art is the 14th. They say it as art as the 14th arcana, but and actually I'm gonna have to double check this because later on in this list it has the devil as the 15th arcana.
Let me pull up something, because I was like, I've worked with this before in some of my own writings. Let me see here what we got here. 14 is temperance. And 15 is the devil.
Yeah, so what was so 11 is justice. 14 is temperance. 15 is the devil, so I was eventually right. 16 Kabuto Wari is the tower.
Man, he looks like a tower. Holy shit. Look at that.
17 Highlander is the star. Mayakashi is the moon. Talkie is the sun. Inu would be the would
Inu is judgment, according to this.
yeah, and Neuro is the world. There's some similarities to the major arcana in this, but the definitions of what each one is and what it's depicting are certainly different. And to that end, I'd say it has a better grasp on using the tarot in a role-playing game system than I've seen some attempt. It'd be an interesting thing to parallel this with, say, Everway, which has its own tarot deck that's unique to it. But then we get into the full setup. From here on out, we will likely be referring to it as Tokyo Nova or TNX, as that's the short version of this iteration of it. But now, one thing I will note with the PDF, because obviously there's no official translation for this. We are reading a fan translation that was done. Much like how there's not an official translation for Devil City Tokyo, which I covered back in December with Coops. Would I like for there to be an official translation? Yeah. But unless one is coming, I'm not going to turn up my nose at fan translations, because as far as I'm concerned, they're doing the Lord's work.
Allows me to read it and check it out.
Yep. But I do like that the PDF here has bookmarks proper, as well as having a hyperlinked table of contents. Now, some of the stuff that is mentioned in the core book is offloaded into some side books. We will cover that kind of thing as it happens, but it's not going to be important for a while. And obviously, the first part, where it says "start reading here," is introducing Hazard City, introducing what a TRPG is, what the Neuro Age is, which is basically a alternate future Earth, the Nova system, as well as the fact that single sessions are referred to as acts. And this is one other thing to keep in mind when it comes to Japanese tabletop. There is a bit of a skewing towards single shot play. That's not to say you can't do a full campaign out of it, but you're going to see a lot of building around scenarios. And a good chunk of that is likely due to the fact that a lot of people playing TTRPGs in Japan are doing so in rented karaoke rooms where time is at a premium, or rented rooms in game stores has gotten more popular over the years.
So time is short when it comes to these games, so they try to keep it condensed as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it then talks a bit about the Arcana. And The tarot deck is kind of used as a broad way to describe characters, since it goes people living in with major arcana. People living in the Neuro Age have 3 styles each. Styles can be the public facade, the persona, the true nature, the key, or hidden qualities, the shadow. These styles are the guideposts, beliefs, professions, talent, social status, and professions necessary to live in the Neuro Age. In TNX, there are 22 styles corresponding to the Neuro deck, like the Tarot, character creation data, and a set of style skills corresponding to each style.
Now that sounds awesome.
What's interesting about that is there is a past, present, future spread when it comes to reading from tarot decks. The idea being one card is drawn upright, one card is drawn reversed, and one card is drawn sideways, i.e. neutral. And then of course all 3 cards are used in interpretation. I'm vastly simplifying it because while I've certainly dabbled with the tarot, I'm not going to consider myself an expert. And if somebody wants the full details on how that kind of reading is going to work, it'd be best to look up info on that themselves.
I've got someone I could probably ask about this for next time.
Yeah. But then the Minor Arcana contains the skills for living in the New Age, as well as data on various equipment and items that bring the New Age to life, such as weapons, vehicles, and so on. Then it goes into what adventures are. There's a few scenarios in the book. We won't be covering the scenarios because as a general rule, I don't cover that kind of thing, because I try to avoid covering modules as much as I can on the off chance that I end up spoiling somebody.
That makes sense.
I mean, the chance is infinitesimally small, but that chance is not 0.
And in this day and age, people are kind of sensitive about that kind of thing.
It's less of a this day and age thing and more of just being courteous.
Right.
Oh. And of course, it goes into necessary participants. The ruler is basically the GM. The cast is the collective term for the player characters. There's also a bit of a sidebar referring to Neurotongue, which I think would be equivalent to the kind of slang that you see cyberpunks use in Night City.
The edge runners, gonks and all that stuff.
So he goes into a bit about winning and losing and how that's not a thing in tabletop, although some GMs seem to think otherwise. Then going into the golden rules. I do like that if somebody makes a check and the GM didn't witness it or confirm the result, then they may be asked to redo it.
No fudging dice.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can't fudge dice in this game because this game doesn't use dice.
No discarding random cards and just drawing a new one.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then it goes into the material needed, and then we get into the playing card setup. Although I will note I do like this priority level thing here, which goes into what parts of the rules are going to be more important for you if you're the GM or not. I know it's called the RL in this thing, but I always use GM just as a catch-all because I'm not paid by the syllable. But when it comes to using playing cards, it says, in TNX, playing cards are used to decide the success or failure of an action or to otherwise produce a random number when needed. Then we go into the suit. The 4 suits of a card, spades, clubs, hearts, and diamonds, play an important role in checks as they denote what attribute you are using and whether or not you are able to utilize a certain skill or skill combo. It should be noted for this that skill is not the same as skill in more traditional RPGs or more ubiquitous ones. Skill in this case is akin to is the catch-all for abilities, spells, techniques, all that kind of stuff. But then we get into the card's value. The card value is the same number as denoted on the card for the numbered cards. The face cards count as a 10, and ace counts as an 11, or you can use it to set the result of your entire check to 21. Jokers are wild and can be used as any card the player or GM wishes, including an ace.
That would make for some interesting gameplay.
Mm-hmm. So you essentially have aces high. But it also means that the best kind of results are ones with aces and jokers, which are going to be rarer than in some cases where the best result would be face cards, which you're going to have a higher chance of drawing a face card than you are drawing an ace. But since there's an emphasis on tarot, it makes sense that we're using a playing card motif, since while the suits in the minor arcana correspond to the suits in a playing card deck. I'm pretty sure you know which goes which. Like what minor arcana suit became the suit in the standard playing card deck. After that, it goes into a very decently sized glossary. One that's...
I was looking at it, it's like ultimate skill. It's like, oh boy.
Yeah. One that is kind of reminiscent of the lexicon that you would see in the first few pages in White Wolf games. You know, just going through a bunch of terms that are going to get a lot of use throughout the game. And several of these are going to be called back to as we go forward. Some of them are tied to the mechanics, and some of them are tied to the setting. And then we get to the Neuro age, which the big thing that caused a lot of changes within the world of Tokyo Nova was essentially a polar shift. Which caused a lot of weather hazards, and basically the global climate pattern to shift rapidly. And if you look on page 25, you'll see what the post-hazards weather looks like for the planet.
The disaster that changed the world. Yikes.
I guess I could liken it to how much of an environmental shift happened in Evangelion after Second Impact. You know, to the point where, like, Japan is always in summer weather for long amounts of time.
I'm sorry, I'm caught up in reading this of like, okay, this is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, the maximum temperatures on Earth, even at the equator, have not gone past 20 degrees Celsius.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And If you'll give me a moment, I will convert Celsius into a real measurement.
I was actually doing that myself. I was like, what the hell is that? 68? That's
Yeah.
not terrible.
That's not terrible. Well, that's certainly not terrible for me. For people in California, that might be devastating. 'Cause that's 68 degrees Fahrenheit. That's like autumn weather. But
After the freeze I had down here, it's starting to get to that point.
Yeah.
And again, where I am, there's two extremes. It's either really, really hot or colder than a witch's tits.
Yep. But essentially, after the disaster that ended up happening, which now given the age of this game, I can say that was Roland Emmerich ripping off Tokyo Nova with The Day After Tomorrow? Probably not, but I'm still gonna make that joke because, dear lord, that movie sucked.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard things.
Mm-hmm. But what did end up resulting is a shift in global politics, especially with some of the biotechnology companies that helped humanity come out of the food crisis.
I'm looking at this map of the post-hazards weather, and I'm just like, dang, change the world that much?
Mm-hmm. You essentially have most of the planet frozen on some level, except for the more equatorial areas.
Yeah, it's like most of the freezings to the north and to the south part of the world. And there's a lot of cold currents in the southern part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much.
And it looks like a lot of the different the continents and everything kind of shifted or broke off.
Yeah. Like you can see an almost 90-degree shift for the Americas that somehow end up re-merging with Eurasia, and Africa just got completely shattered.
Oh man. Yeah, it looks like it got cut right in half.
Mm-hmm. So to say that this was a global disaster is an understatement.
I don't even see Australia on here.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Australia's Australia, though. I'm sure they survived somehow.
Mm-hmm. But the biggest supernation that survived has been Japan. It seems that the primary powers are what's left of North America and Europe and Japan.
Yeah, and it looks like they're all centered in the same place.
Mm-hmm. Also, new nations such as Mithras had made their appearance after a couple of wars. But the biggest political power is with the companies. And this is a case where it does make sense, because a lot of the companies that did get political power after the disasters were places that could readily make food using biotech. When that became scarce during the disasters, that was going to give them a lot of leverage.
Yeah, because they held all the food, and if they control the food, they control everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the food shortages have not been completely solved, even in the current state of the Neuro age. but there are improvements. Most of humanity lives in massive arcologies, and of course things like biotech and cybernetics vastly spread because well, anything that helps people survive in this post-disaster world. But it is a dog eat dog world, as one might expect. And of course with the arcologies came the birth of megaplexes, which, given that they're described as supermassive urban complexes, I guess I could say they're analogous to, say, the megacities in 2000 AD.
I imagine them kind of like the dome cities in Chrono Trigger.
Which, I could see it, but I don't think those dome cities were as big as like Mega City 1 and Judge Dredd.
Now that's a movie I haven't seen in forever.
Which one? The original Stallone one or the better one?
Stallone. I haven't seen the other one yet, but I've heard good things.
It was really damn good, and it kind of got screwed over due to not being able to get proper distribution. But for a bit of context, I'm going to send you an image that I think provides the best frame of reference for how massive Mega City 1 is. And I'm gonna send this directly to you.
Okay.
I'm not going to be able to put it on screen just because doing so is going to be a tricky affair. But
Holy cow!
like
that's almost an entire section of the East Coast.
It pretty much composes a good, like you said, a good amount of the East Coast, going from Boston all the way down to Virginia.
God, and in the radiation zone, like in the middle of one of the radiation zones, there's a habitable zone. Can't talk today.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how?
And of course Tampa is still there, because not even a nuclear apocalypse can kill Floridians.
I was about to say, nothing can kill Floridians.
We've all made the Florida man jokes. We all know how that goes.
Which is why I was wondering about Australia in this world. I mean, they're like on the same level as Floridians, I feel.
Mm-hmm. But it says about 70% of the population lives in these megaplexes, with a single one holding tens of millions of people.
Just judging from this map, those megaplexes have to be massive.
Mm-hmm. And one of the megaplexes is the namesake of the game, Tokyo Nova.
Right.
And in fact, it's stated Tokyo Nova is the largest megaplex. But each of them is kind of a nation state unto themselves. Like the idea of full-on nations isn't as present as the old city-state kind of policy, it appears.
So, kind of like Night City on steroids.
And consider how a lot of early civilizations, it was focused more on individual cities being a nation in and of itself, like some of the city-states you'd see in say ancient Greece. Um, it's that kind of identity. Like since it talks about how people's sense of belonging or being oriented to the city rather than the country. But,
I mean, they're the ones keeping everybody alive, so that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. But there are also some stuff in orbit that are connected to the Earth by space elevators. And
I'm imagining something similar to like the orbital elevator in like Mega Man X8, stretching up all the way into space.
Futurists have talked about the idea of space elevators as a potential thing in the future, which has been explored in science fiction in quite a few elements. I'd say a more recent example would be Ace Combat 7. But then we have a bit of a thing regarding how the world has been cyberized in this post-disaster era.
It's even got little notes on the side here kind of explaining that.
Mm-hmm. But then we have a around the world section that has a more detailed post-hazard map. And so yeah. So that part that we thought was Africa, no, Africa's way up north. In Australia is off to the west. Well, not the far.
So it
not
did
the
survive.
Far, yeah. So we have Shah, Tibet, India, the Caucasus Federation. There's the Holy See, the Great African Union, the American Confederation. Like there are certainly different nations that cropped up, and based on the shape, I have a feeling that Mithras is what, in our world, it would be Antarctica.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, yeah, it is. The Antarctic continent moved to the tectonic movement and became Antarctica Mithrasia, also known as Mithras. Yep.
Talk about a dramatic shift.
Mm-hmm. Australia is the second richest nation after Japan. The Shah Empire is basically a China that's re-embraced imperialism.
Going back to their roots and becoming a superpower as a result, because look at that span of land they got.
Mm-hmm. And somehow Hong Kong is still once again semi-independent.
Imagine playing a session of this game in that city.
Mm-hmm. Overscrolled. Sorry about that. You have the fact that the Russian Federation is still a thing, but most of its territory is covered with permafrost, and the economy is in dire straits. So the Russian Federation mixed with the 90s era Soviet Union, I guess, or early 90s, I should say. Oh.
You said this game was a continuation of the older, like, 80s, 90s version?
The original game came out in 93.
And that was around the time... Wasn't that around the time? No, or was that before the Soviet Union kind of dissolved?
We're talking 93, that would have still been... I'd say by that point it was all. If it hadn't collapsed by that point, the writing was on the wall.
So it makes sense that they'd still kind of have that in this world map. In a manner of speaking.
Yeah. And actually it dissolved in 91. So in 93 we're post collapse.
So yeah, that makes sense why it shrunk so much.
But considering how it was how you don't exactly have a whole lot of warm weather in large swaths of Eurasia as it was, that kind of tectonic shift would devastate them.
For real.
And in fact, the part of Siberia that was once part of Russian territory is independent, known as the Kurultai Siberian Federation. And obviously the place that had the biggest, the most advantageous position after the disaster was Japan. And I just realized, with the way the American Confederation is set up, it ended up merging with Greenland.
Yeah, that's what it said in the text here.
Yep. But and of course with the American Confederation, it still has a good amount of political power, but it's been taken over. That power has been taken over a lot by corporations.
So a lot of that power is kind of diminished and divided among them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then we have a nice little bar that goes into kind of the relationships that happen between nations.
Oh, that's interesting. North American Confederation has good relations with the Villeneuve and the Russian Federation. That's interesting.
When the entire world goes kaput, priorities change.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of different things shifted, not just the land masses, but just relations between the different people.
Mm-hmm. And as hinted at, the supernatural is present as well in this post-disaster world.
Ooh.
But it then goes into a bit of the life of Tokyo Nova, with things like cybertech and cyberware, as well as the introduction of fully sentient AI that can be defined as having life.
Born over a decade ago, so the lifespan is not known yet.
Mm-hmm. But then you also have some of the day-to-day life within the city itself, and the various sections within. Along with, I do like this whole thing of just going through a day in the life of someone living in Tokyo Nova. As well as things like the underground. And even within the underground, there's still conflict between the unions and the various criminal organizations.
Pretty on the surface, pretty bloody underneath.
Mm-hmm. And of course, plenty of terrorists. and even wizards. Like, I think some of the old ways made a comeback after the disaster, and that includes the occult.
And with the supernatural shift in the world, it's not a wonder.
But I think one of the things I appreciate with this is that when it comes to what caused the tectonic shift, that is never gone into, and I'm glad that it isn't. I think that's something that should be up to a table or not brought up at all.
Yeah, leaves it up to the ruler or GM in this case and the players.
Mm-hmm. But after that, we do have a nice little map we have a nice little map guide on page 43 of the various areas of Tokyo Nova and the various levels of security. And because and within that, we do have some maps that go into various districts. Like on page 45, we have a map of the Chuo Ward office district and the different buildings within it. So you can kind of get a feel for how things are going to look. I appreciate that it's not a full detailed map, but it does remind me of some of the maps of Night City.
Reminds me of a map in the game manual I've read of a Sega Genesis version of Shadowrun. It has key buildings, but the rest of the stuff is left to the imagination.
Yeah, which is a good call. Although, are you aware that Shadowrun got a different kind of game on the Sega CD?
I was not. I didn't even know a game on the Sega CD for Shadowrun existed. I was only aware of the SNES and the Genesis.
Yeah, the Sega CD version, which was one of the last Sega CD games to ever get made, never came to the States, and was far more of a visual novel in its approach, as opposed to the action RPG that the Genesis and SNES versions were.
Okay, I did lie. I am aware of Shadowrun Returns.
Mm-hmm.
Good games, by the way.
Yeah, the Harebrained trilogy is a different matter entirely, and it looks like they're working on something new as well. And yes, there was the Shadowrun game on the 360, but I don't like talking about that.
I don't think anybody likes talking about that one. That one was terrible.
I mean, it was a cute little fork of Counter-Strike, but I think people wanted more than that from an IP like Shadowrun. But you know that it's going into the various districts, and we can't go into detail on each of them, but the reason why I ended up thinking of Mega City 1, not Mega City 1, but Night City, is because of how it's sectioned off. Pondsmith had talked about how one of the big influences for him making Night City the way that he did was playing SimCity and his experiences with theme parks.
Yeah, that's why the Night City itself is cordoned off into various districts.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at the way Night City is set up, you can kind of see it as looking like the way a theme park looks.
Yeah, I mean it's been kind of the same thing with the other maps too. It's like, oh, okay, this is here, this is here, this is here.
Mm-hmm. But going into like individual street names or the like, there's no need to do that. and it's not, and there's still plenty of wiggle room for you to put your own places in there. These are just the big mover and shaker kind of places. Yeah.
Man, I would so be down for a game of this. Just looking at these maps and reading all the little flavor text, I'm like, wow, this is really neat.
There's also organization blocks that go into some of the different companies, like the Chihaya Group, the Iwasaki Group, a North American company called TerraWare. Each of them having a block that goes into their official headquarters, where their official name, their GM, and several connections, which are basically potential NPCs you can use that are associated with those organizations.
And they're laid out in a format kind of like the old Cyberpunk books too.
And given how having connections in a setting like this, much like in Shadowrun or Cyberpunk, is as much of a skill as the skills on your character sheet.
Holy cow.
I do have to laugh that that there's a software company called Sephiroth.
Yeah, I saw that. I was like,
I know what it's actually referencing with that, but it's still funny, but I still can't help but make the joke. Because obviously Sephiroth comes from the whole 10 heavenly attributes in Kabbalism. I think one of the other ones to have a bit of a laugh in is Marionette.
Marionette, yeah.
Obviously it's meant to be a play on Marionette, like a doll, but the way the logo looks, it almost looks like Marionette.
Just imagine just doing like a little parody of that in the game. It's me.
But there is one anime that I feel like its aesthetic could be a good template for resource material if I was to run a game of Tokyo Nova. Are you familiar with an OVA called Megazone 23?
No, I am not, actually.
We covered it when we were doing the Parliament of Geeks some time ago. I won't say Megazone 23 is a great OVA, but it is the Patient Zero that kicked off the OVA bubble of the late 80s and early 90s. When it came to showing the viability of direct-to-video, since it was going to be a full-on 12-episode anime. Then the funding got cut midway through, so they just released the 3 episodes. They cobbled things together with the episodes that they had made, and ended up making something straight to DVD, thinking, "Oh, this isn't going to work, or this isn't going to be a success." It was a massive success, and there was an attempt to try and use some of the footage in it for quote-unquote Robotech the movie, but I guarantee you haven't seen that because it only showed up once at a screening in Texas and never showed up again.
The only thing of Robotech I am even remotely familiar with is, I believe, an old PlayStation 1 game. It was a demo I played some time ago.
Yeah.
But God, I don't remember everything exactly, but I remember you could transform into a jet, then you could become a mech.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty standard fare. I don't remember a Robotech game on the PS1 as far as one that was.
It was either Robotech or Macross. I don't remember.
It's probably Macross because we didn't get much in the way of Robotech video games until the PS2 era stateside. We probably would have gotten more if Harmony Gold wasn't being assholes. But after going into a lot of organizations, then you have a section on personalities. And the personalities here are essentially the movers and shakers of Tokyo Nova. And this sort of thing of doing these brief descriptions of of NPCs like this is standard fare in a lot of Japanese tabletop. Though going into their stats is something that you don't see in Sword World, for instance. A lot of times they'll go into gender, race, and age in Sword World, but in this we have the full setup, and you can kind of get a hint as to how stats are going to work.
Looks like they have a minimum and a maximum. No real levels, but God, I feel like I've seen this before in something akin to like Castle Falkenstein, which also uses cards, but I think it uses the suits and the skills a bit differently than something like this.
Mm-hmm. As far as whether or not one inspired the other, I could see it. If only by proxy. I'm not entirely sure if Castle Falkenstein had a significantly large fan base in Japan. Then again, inspiration can come from strange places.
I wasn't necessarily meaning inspiration. That's probably a verbiage problem on my part. I just see kind of elements of Falkenstein in Tokyo Nova.
Yeah, and well, now admittedly the placeholder ones, these were parts that just weren't translated yet.
Mm-hmm.
But at the very least, you get a chance to enjoy some of the art for it. And then afterwards, it talks about Neuro tongue, which is essentially the some of the slang that's used within the city. And obviously, the next thing it would go into is character creation, but we won't be covering that this week. So I know we skimmed through a bunch of stuff, but what's been your first impressions just with the presentation of Tokyo Nova?
I feel like it lays out and establishes the world, which is something I really look for in a lot of RPGs, and something I really haven't seen much, at least in some of the role-playing games that I've played.
Mm-hmm.
And, it establishes the world very well, it basically sets you up to make your own game, and that is something I feel, is really key when I try to run stuff like this.
I've seen some people try and argue that having a defined setting is too restrictive, which it can be in some cases. Like I'd have a tricky time if I was to run a campaign in the BattleTech universe, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But
I guess I suppose it really depends on the game and the what is established in the setting.
Mm-hmm. Like, I'm a big fan of L5R, and I will admit that the amount of history with that setting can be a bit of a hurdle at first, which is why the whole Emerald Magistrates thing became a good way to introduce people. But my whole thing has always been, you either need to have a setting / vibe or be agnostic about it. You can't do both. And my problem with certain ubiquitous fantasy games has been trying to play both sides. Like trying to say, oh, you can use this to run any kind of fantasy, but very clearly skewing towards Western European pastiches.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you want to skew in that direction, that's fine. But as the saying goes, don't piss on my head and tell me it's raining.
You can't have it both ways. Try as you might.
And I know some inevitably will argue, oh, you can house rule that. Is it really house ruling when I'm having to come up with dozens and dozens of stuff to fill in the blanks? If I was to take a more East Asian approach to, say, Castles and Crusades, then I'd have to make whole new races, classes, weapons, armor, all of that. Am I really homebrewing at that point?
No, not really. But then again, with a game like Castles, they have a lot of books and resources for that anyway. So I guess it really doesn't matter at that point.
Mm-hmm. But you see the point here.
Yeah.
And Todd Howard and Bethesda get a lot of shit for the fact that you've got to mod the shit out of their games in order to make them work. It's the same principle here.
It's just optimized. You just have to upgrade your computer. God, fucking Todd Howard.
And yet they've been using the exact same code for the last 2 generations.
This just works.
I know they claim the creation engine is a brand new engine. It really isn't. It's a dressed up version of the Gamebryo engine. It would be like saying imagine saying that say Ion Fury is using a brand new version of the build engine.
Oh no, it's just using a very well-dressed version of the build engine.
Yeah.
It's still got the same problems, but it's more dense, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Or that GZ Doom is a brand new version of id Tech.
No, I think it's a fork of Z Doom, if I'm not mistaken.
It's built on the source engine.
Okay, I stand corrected.
Yeah, a lot of the more modern both Doom ports and the like are not built on the old id Tech, but built on the source engine and made to look like id Tech. Except for the Bethesda port that's using a heavily modified version of an old id Tech and Kex.
id 24 running through Kex. Now that's something.
Yeah. But the point is that with this particular game, it is not meant to be run as some sort of catch-all cyberpunk. It is meant, you can clearly see it's meant to be run within Tokyo Nova, the city.
And that's something I've not seen, especially in a lot of Western tabletop.
Yeah.
Because from what you've described, a lot of Western tabletop is, I guess, modular. In a manner of speaking.
Some of the larger names are, but it's really a case by case thing. Stuff like when I bring up the world's most litigious RPG, that is, of course, my shorthand for D&D, and how it's played shit or got off the pot or half-seas regarding whether or not it has a setting. And what one could argue, 5th edition's setting is Forgotten Realms, but it doesn't commit to that.
No, because it goes into Eberron, I think it goes some into Greyhawk, and it goes into Kryn. It goes all over the place.
Yeah, they've dipped into those, and there's nothing wrong with alternate settings, but when I look at the core rules, the main 3 rule books, it gives lip service at best to whether or not it's set in the Forgotten Realms.
Mm-hmm. and I think it's just a lot of the modules for 5e that kind of say, "Oh, this is set here," like Waterdeep, which is the current thing I'm running with castles.
Yeah, and Waterdeep is a place in Forgotten Realms that has been for years, but it's a case of if it's not in the core books, I'm not counting it.
Right.
Contrast that with, say, Cyberpunk. While you can play Cyberpunk games outside of Night City, most people aren't doing that. The majority of Cyberpunk games are going to be placed in Night City.
In some way or form, because the way they have it, they haven't really, I guess, not fleshed out, because I know they talk about like
It
how
has
Night
been
City
fleshed out.
separate.
In,
Oh, okay.
Like because keep in mind, Red is just the most recent version. Pondsmith's Cyberpunk game got started in the late 80s.
Yep. 85, I believe it was.
Yeah, then in the late 80s and early 90s you had 2020, then you had V3, which we don't talk about, and now we have Red, which is meant to be a in-between point in timeline-wise between 2020 and 2077.
Oh, right. I remember seeing a thing on Wisefish's lore videos on Cyberpunk. That was the day that I think like nukes dropped on a major building in Arasaka, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Basically Arasaka and Militech were kind of out of the picture, and a massive power vacuum emerged, which is the time of the Red. But point is, that's taking place in Night City mostly, and it very much is blatant on that in the text. Shadowrun is taking place in its version of Seattle. Legend of the Five Rings, which I mentioned before, is very much taking place in its world, Rokugan.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of see that particular pattern, even with games that don't have a setting but have kind of a vibe, like say the World of Darkness games, which instead of having a defined setting, have a vibe with what's referred to as the modern knights. Basically going less into a given setting and more of the politics between, say, the different vampire clans and how those can be integrated into a given city. Which is why you see a lot of campaigns called City Name by Night.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that on YouTube, more specifically with like live play shows.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of been inbuilt in that universe for the longest time. That kind of thinking of being built specifically around a setting or a vibe is very much present in the Japanese tabletop scene. Sword World has its setting, Raxia.
Mm-hmm.
And while Raxia is in the 2.0 version, there was a different setting in the 1.0 era, which is what is indirectly tied to Lodos. It's a bit complicated.
Yeah, I did read on the Lodos article that I pulled up that it used elements of D&D and Sword World.
I'll get into the story a bit later. And the translation team for Sword World has done a very good breakdown on the matter, which we did cover during the Sword World Study Hall live stream. But I think what's going to be interesting from my perspective is seeing how this game handles cards, and whether or not it's a case of you draw from the top of a deck anytime you do an action, or you have a hand like you do in the Saga system in like Dragonlance 5th Age and the Marvel Adventure game. which is an interesting beast in of itself, where in those games, your hand was both your level and your health.
Oh, wow.
And you would... the different suits would be associated with different abilities, and if you played a card in the same suit, you could play another card from the top of the deck. Which, if that was also the same suit, you could keep going. But because of the fact that these suits were showing up in the way that they were on the NPC list we saw, the vibe that I get is that you are going to be somewhat assigning what suits you'll have available for certain skills. But we'll come back to that when we get to the actual mechanics, which is not going to be for a bit.
Can't wait.
Mm-hmm. But with that said, that is more or less going to cover this edition of the Valley. We will be back here next Friday, going into character creation, which is definitely going to be an interesting beast. Because it's not I can say this, it's not exactly freeform, but it's not full freeform. It's kind of in that halfway point, in the same way that, Legend Edition has a class system, but not in the typical way. So that's something to certainly keep an eye out for.
I'm gonna have to get a notebook for that, because this is gonna be fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're probably going to be taking notes quite a bit.
Oh, I'm a big note taker.
Yep. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ